you can take the man out of television, but you cannot take television out of the man.
I mean, this is being celebrated as this gigantic peace deal, and Trump deserves the Nobel Peace Prize. The reality is much less dramatic than that. When you look at what Netanyahu is saying publicly to the world and what he's saying to Israelis, and what he's saying to Israelis is that this is not over.
Is there just a complete lack of structure ready?
We see some sort of disturbing signs that this may end up looking like a Western umbrella dictating to Palestinians what they can do, what they can't do.
Hello and welcome to this week's edition of TrumpWorld. I'm Matt Frei in London.
I'm Anushka Asthana in Washington, D.C. And what a delight to have you back, Matt. Did
Yes.
you have a nice holiday?
We ended up in Rome and that was lovely.
Yeah, you're back, so it's all good. So just, you have covered the Middle East for, again, I don't want to age you, but decades. Living in Israel back in 1989, when I was at school.
Yeah.
Just like historical context. And I was speaking to a former negotiator a few weeks ago who made this argument that they felt the closest the two sides had ever been was 2000, and that the gap was still at the time a Grand Canyon. Putting this into a historical context, how do you see it?
Well, I think in some ways there are good things and bad things. The good thing is that Donald Trump has used American power in a way that even Bill Clinton didn't use American power when he managed to get the Oslo Accords signed by Yasser Arafat for the PLO, for the Palestinians, and Yitzhak Rabin for the Israelis. So he was, he played the role of the kind of honest broker in the middle. There was a proper peace plan, which of course ended up in dust a few years later, partly because Yitzhak Rabin was assassinated, but also, the process ran out of steam, and the White House didn't give it the right amount of attention it should have done because it was just distracted by other things like Monica Lewinsky, like the wars in the former Yugoslavia, to give that process its full attention. And so on the distraction front, that's probably bad news for Donald Trump because he will lose interest in this, I suspect, quite quickly. Where it was fascinating was to see Trump intervene in a very personal way because everything is personal for him. Just as he says, I'm upset with Russia, not because they've invaded a country, but because Vladimir Putin has let me down. He promised things that he didn't deliver. In the same way, Netanyahu let Trump down when he bombed Qatar, Trump's best mates in the Middle East, who were going to give him a shiny plane one day. And without checking with Trump, and Trump, if he had checked, Trump would have said, "You've got to be kidding. You're not going to do that." And so it is personal. And Trump clearly got to a stage, many would say very late, because he was at that stage, remember, back in February, and then he allowed the Israelis to break the ceasefire. But he got to that stage where he said, right, enough is enough. The fighting's got to stop. We've got that Nobel deadline on the 10th of October, which, by the way, I think was crucial in his own mind. Let's get this wrapped up. He always thought about the second anniversary, October the 7th. And then, it happened round about then in those days, too late for the Nobel Committee. But in his own mind, that was important. And I think, so historically, listen, we've had this Arab-Israeli conflict has been going on since 1948. Some would say it started earlier with the Balfour Declaration and all that.
Donald Trump says thousands of years.
Thousands of years. Okay, you want to talk Bible? We can talk Bible. I talked to Mike Huckabee, his ambassador in Israel the other day, and I said, Mr. Huckabee, isn't it weird that you're using the Old Testament, as a guide for, how to solve geopolitical issues today? And Mike Huckabee said, not at all. It's all about the Old Testament. Anyway, that's by the by. The point is that in the past, when there were serious efforts at peace in the Middle East, which have all failed, right? They have all consumed months and months of negotiations. There were processes in place. They've all failed because either the Israelis, often the Israelis, or the Palestinians didn't do what it said on the tin. But at least in those days, you had a kind of honest-ish broker in the middle. I mean, with a big-ish, to be honest, right? Because the Israelis are always going to be able to rely on America in the way that the Palestinians can't. But even the Oslo Accords, which were greeted with the same kind of fanfare that we saw in Jerusalem and in Sharm el-Sheikh this week, they ended up nowhere because the process wasn't solid enough. It wasn't kept honest enough. The Palestinians didn't do enough on their side, and the Israelis didn't give them enough rope in order to establish a degree of self-determination, and the Americans didn't enforce it. None of those things exist now as well. So I don't see this ending anywhere in a happy place, I'm afraid.
It's interesting you make that comparison because in a way, that was even more of a moment because we actually had that famous picture of the three of them together, Rabin and Arafat together. You kind of can't really imagine now, despite what is a huge breakthrough. And I think the credit to Donald Trump is, however similar this might be to former plans, he actually forced Netanyahu to sign up to it. But you can't imagine a situation now where we've got Netanyahu and Abbas together.
Well, hang on. He didn't turn up. Netanyahu did not turn up to Sharm el-Sheikh, right? And that was so important. His absence was so glaring and so important because he had Trump all to himself. Trump went to the Knesset. He's met the hostage families. He did an Israeli version of TrumpWorld, of the Trump show. And it was great for Israel. And there was all this, joking and riffing going on. He pointed to the Israeli president. Why didn't you give this guy, as in Netanyahu, a pardon? Perhaps not understanding how the Israeli system works.
But they gave him a standing ovation as well. It was the most extraordinary thing. Donald Trump's like, cigars, champagne, who cares? It's like he's accused Netanyahu, and of course he denies it, of, taking $200,000 worth of gifts and of lightening regulation for a media company in return for good coverage. But yeah, I found that moment extraordinary as well.
But to get back to the glaring absence of Netanyahu, if Netanyahu doesn't bother to show up in Sharm el-Sheikh for the summit to which everyone has shown up, everyone was there except for the guy you really need to be there, who needs to be seen to be shaking Mahmoud Abbas's hand, however frail that hand is, however much he dislikes it. That has to happen, and it didn't happen.
And it will never happen because he has very clear that Abbas can't have a role in this if Israel's going to sign up to it. But then who?
Who does, right? So Marwan Barghouti is stuck in jail. They're not going to let him out. They haven't released him. And, he's often called the Nelson Mandela of this process. Well, they're not going to release him. And the question I constantly have in my mind, and I was extremely happy that despite not being there, that the hostages were released and that there was a ceasefire, of a sort, and that people were going back to their houses. You have no prospect of any kind of future, let alone a state. Where's the job going to come from? 93% of agricultural land in Gaza has been destroyed. It will take a long time to get that back up and running, let alone rebuilding all these homes. I mean, the amount of anger and rage and vengefulness against Israel, but also against Hamas, and how they will respond to it. They're still armed. They're not going to give up their arms anytime soon.
It really looks like the opposite.
But think of the emotion that will be, at the moment it's all about, we've survived, right? We've survived 2 years. We're still living. We still have a pulse. Let's go back to where we came from. The minute you have the time to reflect on what's actually gone down and who's responsible for it, you're going to build up so many layers of resentment that you need the biggest and the best trust building machine on the planet. And I don't see anything like that kit anywhere on the horizon.
There are a couple of things I think we can be very positive about, which we could just come to. But can we just pause on the actual scenes in Egypt with Donald Trump at the podium and all the world leaders desperate to be there? I really wished, as I was watching it, that I could have had a mind read of what Keir Starmer and Giorgia Meloni were thinking, because they got their coveted spaces right behind him. And I thought Starmer looked so uncomfortable, folding his arms, kind of going, oh.
It's so medieval. It's so monarchical, the way that they all come up and kiss his ring. They're summoned up individually. He wasn't even in Washington. He was in Sharm el-Sheikh, for goodness sake, in someone else's country. And he got the great award, the Order of the Nile. Then he got some Israeli award as well. I mean, he is the most garlanded president ever in the history of peacemaking, which we know is thousands of years.
He was telling off Norway at one point because he's so upset about the Nobel Peace Prize. And to be fair, there is precedent in 2009 of Obama winning it based on what had happened in 2009, not 2008.
Of course.
I mean, if it really is this big kind of motivator for him, I suppose the fact that it's still on the table potentially for next year is a good thing if that's really what the aim of it is. I was speaking to someone on the Qatari side yesterday who was basically arguing it's not really about the Nobel Peace Prize. It's about him wanting to show that he's a deal maker around the world, which I think can have some problems for him here in the US, because although obviously it was a huge story and it was all over the newspapers and the TV stations, already today you can see that it is not the priority for people in America. And how is he going to play this with also being an America first president? I mean, the bit I think that is the most hopeful, I guess, from all of this is that America has always been very one-sided in the Middle East. And I think still is, absolutely. You could see in that Knesset speech, Israel's ally first and foremost. But Donald Trump feels really quite passionately about the relationships he's built with Arab countries. I suspect it's a lot to do with the amount of money that can be made from all of this. But nevertheless, listening to him say to reporters about the Qataris, like they said, in 2017, you accused them of funding terrorism. And he said, oh, yeah, I just didn't know them then. Didn't know them very well then.
Well,
I've changed
people
my
change,
mind.
Anushka, people change, they evolve, they develop,
But he's now signed an executive order, which is almost feels like an Article 5 for Qatar. If Qatar is attacked, that is like an attack on American peace.
And exactly. And especially if anyone attacks a new jumbo jet that's being built somewhere on a Qatari airbase, they deserve the worst kind of punishment. I mean, again, you like a lot of Trump stuff, you can't really make it up. You really can't make it up. But I think what's so fascinating about this Sharm el-Sheikh moment is also that, and thank God our podcast is called TrumpWorld, because it really is, whether you are, Chinese, Russian, North Korean, Iranian, none of these people like Trump anymore particularly. It is how he channels presidential power, his interpretation of presidential power from America. And it makes all these other people who are there to kiss his ring like sort of, extras in another version of The Apprentice. It is, you can take the man out of television, but you cannot take television out of the man. And I think, again, the best thing we can do is weaponize his vanity for the next Nobel Prize. Honestly, I think if I was the Nobel Committee, I would talk to the Saudis, and I would talk to the Qataris, and I would talk to the Israelis as well, and whoever you can talk to on the Palestinian side. So can we just ring up Donald Trump every week, let's say Thursday, 10 o'clock in the morning, when he's having his second cup of hot chocolate or whatever he drinks, and just remind him that prize is so his prize if you could only do the following 5 things. Because weaponizing his vanity, and that's what it is, or narcissism, and I've experienced it, firsthand, is literally the best hope that we have of peace in the Middle East or peace in Ukraine. And if that's what it takes, go for it.
Yeah, because in the end, it's worth it. Although I was thinking if there was to be a Nobel Peace Prize, I feel a bit sorry for these mediator countries, which have played such a critical role. Could it be joint with them, maybe?
Oh, yeah. Trump doesn't. Are you kidding me? Trump doing joint? You got to be. No. They've got to get little. Maybe there can be mini prize, or like, he invented the meme coin in his own family's name. There's his meme coin, and there's Melania's meme coin, and the kids have got a meme coin. Maybe there can be a meme coin, a sort of mini Nobel meme coin or mini Nobel Prize, like a tiny, tiny little one that they get, because he might just about stomach that. But I think anything that queers his Nobel pitch, as it were, would be a really, really bad idea. And of course, what's so interesting is that he's now got Zelensky coming to, and a team of Ukrainian negotiators coming to the White House, and you'll be there on Friday. And maybe he thinks the way that Blair once did after the Good Friday Agreement, that he can sort of, ride the wave of peace all the way to Ukraine. I mean, it'll be so interesting to see whether that will persuade him to give the Ukrainians what they really want from the Americans, which is the permission to buy, not be given, Tomahawk long-range missiles, 1,500-mile range. That could take out not just bits in Moscow, but also targets well beyond that in the Urals. That would be a really big deal for Ukraine. And it comes at a moment when Russia is feeling apparently a little bit more vulnerable than it did, because that Donald Trump love bombing moment in Alaska did not go as well as they thought it did. So let's see whether Trump can ride this wave and weaponize his vanity in other useful ways.
The difference, though, of course, is Vladimir Putin and Benjamin Netanyahu have totally differing relationships with Donald Trump, and America's influence over Russia isn't the same as it is over Israel. So it's quite a different thing. Can I just ask you one thing? You mentioned the Balkans when we were talking earlier and your time there. And I know that you were in Sarajevo when a lot of the stuff you were talking about was happening. And one of the big things there is what happens next. Once you've got an agreement, what do you need? And are there any signs of some of the practical things you need this time round?
So Sarajevo was really interesting, and I'm glad you brought it up, because that was a conflict. The ex-Yugoslavia was falling apart. The Serbs, who were the dominant power in the kind of super former Yugoslavia, basically decided to protect Serbian minorities wherever they existed, which meant that Bosnian independence or Croatian independence within the borders as defined in the former Yugoslavia was a problem, because there were always these Serb minorities living in these countries, these fledgling countries, and the Serbs used that as an excuse. Our minority of Serbs is under fire, in order to basically either carve away at those new countries, or try and dominate them. And in the case of Bosnia, America wasn't really interested. In fact, P.J. O'Rourke, the right-wing, very abrasive, very funny author, said it's like the unspellables versus the unpronounceables. In other words, this is foreign stuff. It's happening on Europe's doorstep. They should deal with it. A little bit hints of Ukraine there, the kind of language used today about Ukraine. Let them sort it out. Except that Europe couldn't sort it out. The EU was useless at sorting it out. And so America finally got involved. And actually, it was Tony Blair, when he became prime minister, who really held, as soon as he became prime minister, Bill Clinton's feet to the fire on a related issue in Kosovo, to say, you've got to put American brutes on the ground. You've got to get involved with airstrikes. You've got to tell the Serbs that they cannot carry on messing around in the way that they did. And then at the end of this process, which did involve American military intervention, there was the so-called Dayton process. So the Dayton Accords in Dayton, Ohio. Now, I know you'll be going to Ohio, but you may not be anymore, because it's not as much of a swing state as it used to be. I've been there 26 times. Dayton, Ohio, boring town. It has a military airbase on it, right, or near it. And that's where Richard Holbrooke, who was the Assistant Secretary of State under Madeleine Albright, the Secretary of State, and Bill Clinton. And he basically was in charge of this process, which involved getting all the different parties from the wars, the Croats, the Serbs, the Bosniaks, all into this airbase. They all got the same crappy accommodation. And apparently, I talked to someone who was there at the time helping to organize it. He said, we spent a lot of time basically persuading them that their rooms were just as bad as the other parties' rooms. No one got a better deal. The Serbs weren't living in 5-star luxury while all the others were in 2-star luxury. It was all 1-star across the board, and they all had to eat in a canteen together. And Holbrooke, it was almost like a sort of conclave of old, where he said, you're going to make an agreement here. Here's the outline. Here's the plan. We're going to help enforce it. But you've got to come up with this agreement. And if you don't, I'm going to take away your lunch and your dinner, and you'll be stuck in this miserable place for even longer. And they did it. It took a couple of weeks, but they sorted it out. There was the Dayton Accords. And although, people have tried to chip away at them, and things in Bosnia look a bit shaky these days, and Serbia is, also in a pretty bad place, that was 30 years ago, roughly. And it's held that long. And in the Balkans, that's something you can take to the bank. So I think it needs a process. It needs for America to enforce it as an honest broker, which obviously the Palestinians at the moment don't really think it is. And it needs, for all the sides to eyeball each other at some stage. I mean, you can go to their respective barracks and hotel rooms and say, we've got this and we've got that. And that's what the Qataris have been doing brilliantly for years. But at some stage, Netanyahu, or whoever replaces him, has to look, whichever Palestinian is the interlocutor on the other side, eyeball to eyeball, shake on it, sign a piece of paper, and know that the Americans, maybe with the UN, maybe not, are there to enforce it.
And I guess, Matt, that's the next big question. What happens now? Does phase 2 actually happen? Is Donald Trump interested in it? Which I think is the perfect time to bring in our guest.
I'm very happy to introduce our guest for this edition of TrumpWorld, Jasmine El-Gamal. She's a veteran of the Department of Defense in the US. She's worked for 3 secretaries of defense as a Middle East analyst. She knows all about how the process of what you do, when you end a war, and therefore she's the perfect person to talk to us about Gaza, but also what the process is, what the formalities are, what the legalities might be. And I'm very happy to say that she's got her own podcast called The View from Here. Jasmine, welcome to the program.
Thank you so much for having me.
There's a lot to unpack here. And of course, the world is still high on the kind of on the sugar high of the ceasefire, which is kind of holding, although there have been some very alarming developments there. The release of the hostages, they're all out now. The mood in Israel was extraordinarily euphoric, as we kept seeing on television. But it was also, whether in Israel or indeed in Sharm el-Sheikh at the summit, it was all about Donald J. Trump. This was the Trump show, was it not?
It really was. And you know what? For once, it was deserved. It was well deserved because we have known for such a long time. And Matt, I remember talking to you, throughout the last 2 years on the news channel and talking about the various, stages of the war and how it can be stopped and who can stop Prime Minister Netanyahu. And for most of the time, our conversations were happening under the Biden administration. And the big question that everyone had on their minds was, what leverage does the US have to shape the Israeli response in Gaza? And why aren't they using that leverage? And so we have always known that this war would be shaped and eventually ended with US pressure. That was the only way it was going to stop, because that's the only country that the Israeli prime minister would listen to, and the only country that had power over the Israeli prime minister, right? The US is the largest supplier of weapons to the US. It protects Israel on the international stage using the US veto in the UN Security Council when necessary, all different kinds of things. And so what we saw throughout the Biden administration was a reluctance to use that powerful American leverage. And that was a very personal choice by President Biden. I have spoken to so many of my former colleagues in the US government, and the wall-to-wall consensus is that this was Biden's decision every single time. So when Donald Trump came in and he made it clear that he wanted to come in and end these wars in Ukraine and in Gaza, he put on that pressure. We saw a ceasefire in January. It fell through when they started negotiating the second phase of that ceasefire. Prime Minister Netanyahu said, I don't want to go into phase 2. I want to change the terms. President Trump lost energy and focus for a while, and then he came back after Israel overstepped by trying to assassinate the Hamas negotiators in Qatar. He came back with a vengeance, with the full force of US pressure, and made this ceasefire happen. So he does deserve the credit for that.
He does, and the way you're saying it, but it just leads me to the question, why did Joe Biden not use that leverage? Did you get a sense of the motivation that was holding him back? He was under a lot of pressure from within his own party by the end.
Yes, and the American public as well, which over the last 2 years have really increasingly leaned towards an end to the war, a rethinking of U.S. support for Israel and how unconditional it is, and wanting to look into that. And so he had what he needed to be able to make those decisions. By all accounts, everyone that I've spoken to, and this is also in the public, and you've seen former officials and DC based reporters write about this, it was a personal love for Israel and not wanting to be seen as betraying Israel in what he saw was its time of need.
But it also was a personal slight to Donald Trump, the bombing of Qatar to try and take out the Hamas negotiators, bombing the country that was going to give Trump his shiny new plane, where America has its most important military base in the Middle East. These are the guys that Trump really likes and gets on with, and then suddenly get bombed. And they didn't really check properly with Trump whether they were allowed to do so. There was quite a lot of fuzziness around that. But I think for Trump, that was an absolute game changer. And he then famously, of course, made Netanyahu ring them up on a sort of old style phone and apologize to the emir personally. And he did this in the Oval Office. It was photographed by the White House photographers. They put the picture out there. And for Netanyahu, that would have been a moment of humiliation. Now, the question is, though, how do you convert this very personal style of politics, where it's all about who kisses the ring and who doesn't, into a process that allows you to disarm Hamas, make sure the Israelis withdraw behind a certain line, help rebuild Gaza, most importantly, help rebuild trust, have, some truth and reconciliation committee about all the horrible stuff that's gone down. Trump alone cannot do that, and Trump may not want to do that. And surely, Jasmine, that's a problem.
Mm. I mean, that's the $1 million question right now, isn't it? I mean, this is being celebrated as this gigantic peace deal, and, the worst is over, and Trump deserves the Nobel Peace Prize, and all of that stuff, and all of those things. And the reality is much less dramatic than that. It's about details, it's about process, it's about what happens next and who is going to show up to start implementing the deal. And there are a lot of challenges ahead. I can talk about a couple that, in my mind, are the most worrying in terms of, if we don't get this right, we could see a return to conflict. One is that Prime Minister Netanyahu obviously unwillingly signed, this ceasefire deal. He had been under a lot of pressure from his fellow, the extreme right wing portion of his cabinet, which represents that side of Israeli society. Ben-Gvir and Smotrich, we know those names, the security minister and the finance minister. And they had been pressuring him for months and months not to sign any deal that would involve a permanent end to conflict. And that was one of the reasons that the ceasefire fell through in January, is because once the initial phase was done and the exchange of that first batch of hostages was released, Netanyahu didn't want to commit to ending the war. He wanted to be able to go back. The problem with that is that there are different visions that are being discussed in Israel, and the differences between what the Israelis are saying to the English-speaking public, to the world, and what they're saying inside their own country, domestically, in their own language. And you can see the difference in those two tones when you look at what Netanyahu is saying publicly to the world and what he's saying to Israelis. And what he's saying to Israelis is that this is not over, that he knows that there are still people who want to destroy Israel, that he's going to be keeping an eye on it, and that he's going to go in again if he needs to. And all you need to do is look at the ceasefire that was signed in Lebanon, which has been violated nearly every day since it's been signed. So this idea that Israel wants to continue to go into Gaza at will whenever it sees a need is a big loophole that was in that ceasefire agreement. And has the potential to derail that process altogether. The other big one, of course, is what you mentioned, Matt, about Hamas's disarmament. And there have already been discussions that have started about what that process could look like, who Hamas would turn their weapons over to, if they did turn their weapons over to, whether that would be to a Palestinian government authority, a Palestinian force, whether those weapons would be held and frozen, or whether they will just keep their weapons. So that's one of the big things that is still going to be worked out, I think, over the next few months.
And the early signs on that are not particularly positive. We've already seen what looks like public executions by Hamas. It looks like they're trying to use their arms to make sure they retain control over Gaza. And I thought it was really extraordinary, really, because when Donald Trump was asked about that, I think by journalists on the plane on the way home, he said they do want to stop problems and they've been open about it. And we gave them approval for a period of time. Do you think, I mean, just comparing it to like previous situations that you've been in, is there just a complete lack of structure ready to, I mean, not that there's been great examples in the past either, but, ready to actually make this happen?
There's definitely a lack of structure. And that's partly because the Palestinians have been so divided for so long. And I think there's an excellent article that I'd love to recommend to your readers in the New Yorker that just came out by a Palestinian journalist called Mohammed Mahawish. And it talks about the next steps and that political process that needs to happen inside of Gaza right now. And it really parses through the different rivalries between Palestinian factions and parties. It talks about the mistakes that have been made since Oslo, since the Oslo peace agreement, and why that was bad for Palestinian unity. So it's a really fascinating piece that I would recommend to anyone. And it just goes into how complicated it's going to be to unify all of these different factions and parties under one umbrella that will be able to govern Gaza. But that's only one part of it, that internal part. The other part is how controlling external forces are going to be and how much they will actually allow Palestinians to try to do that hard work internally and try to come up with a governing structure and reconciliation and all those things that they have to do. Right now, we see some sort of disturbing signs that this may end up looking like a Western umbrella dictating to Palestinians what they can do, what they can't do, who will be appointed, who cannot be appointed. You have this board of peace that's supposedly going to oversee this Palestinian technocratic government, which is going to be headed by Donald Trump nominally. I'm sure he's not obviously going to be involved in the day to day, but they're talking about bringing in Tony Blair, which is hugely distressing for a lot of Palestinians and a lot of Arabs in general, given Tony Blair's involvement in the Iraq War, his history in the region, this sense that he doesn't really understand the needs of the Palestinians and won't be advocating for them either, that this is just going to be some kind of really tightly managed operation to try to exert as much value and benefit that they can out of Palestinian reconstruction and all other kinds of stuff like that. And even the who is going to be part of the technocratic government, there are worries that those names are not going to be names that have any credibility inside of Palestine, but that just have good contacts in the West, basically. And of course, we've seen all of those things play out in Iraq before, after the war, and other post-conflict environments in the Arab world and Africa and other places.
But also under whose mandate? So, for instance, the idea that you send Turkish or Qatari or Saudi peacekeepers into Gaza, when you've got Hamas reluctant to disarm, when you've got the IDF, constantly in the wings, and they come across some very difficult decisions and they have to decide whether to, shoot someone or not. On whose authority will they do that? Will that be UN authority? I mean, I think Trump has suggested that CENTCOM, the American military structure in the Middle East, would be in charge, which would be troubling for many people. I mean, who are the honest brokers in this process, not just militarily, but also politically? And who do you speak to on the Palestinian side?
Yeah, I mean, those are all such good questions, Matt. None of these questions were fully discussed and let alone answered when this peace agreement was being signed. I mean, we saw the declaration from Cairo several months ago where all the Arab and Muslim states got together and issued the Cairo plan for what a post-war Gaza would look like. And it talked about all these things. A lot of the elements of that plan ended up in Trump's plan, by the way. The technocratic government, dealing with issues of Hamas's arms, all kinds of things. And those are the details that are going to be hammered out right now. I will tell you one thing, that Hamas, just like there's never been this much pressure on the Israelis before by the Americans, Hamas has also not been under this kind of pressure before as it is right now. Everyone from Turkey to Egypt to Qatar, they are all there making sure that this deal goes the way it is supposed to go and that those questions are answered in a way that doesn't bring us back to conflict. The players that were involved in this, you had the top intelligence chiefs in Turkey, in Egypt. Those are traditionally the people who've had the closest ties with Hamas over the years and had the closest relationships with them and therefore the most leverage. And so I would say that despite all my misgivings and my concerns about the way forward, this is one of the best chances that we've seen in a long, long time, simply because of who's involved, how closely involved they are, and what leverage they have over the two parties.
But the ultimate goal in that plan is vaguely set out, but it is towards Palestinian statehood. It's what Palestinians ultimately want. And having listened to hours and hours and hours now of Donald Trump talking about this, because he talks about it at length. He was doing it again yesterday when he was meeting the Argentinian president, talking about the 8 wars he's ended, of course. It is really interesting to listen to him. It's gone up, yeah, because, sometimes there's a very measured response. You mentioned Tony Blair. I thought it was really interesting how he basically said, yeah, I do need to check that everyone's okay with Tony Blair. And it had fed through to him that there might be some misgivings about Tony Blair in the Middle East, although, of course, Blair was still there. But on the other hand, we get like the bombastic address to the Knesset where he's, trumpeting moving the US embassy to Jerusalem, trumpeting giving, recognizing Israeli sovereignty over the Golan Heights, and so on. And the thing that I've watched is that when he's asked about statehood, Palestinian statehood, despite the fact that it's there written into the plan, he vaguely, with a lot of caveats, he said, someone said to him, what's your view on a 2-state solution? He said, I don't have a view. I mean, he is not personally engaged as you go further through this plan is the big concern, because he doesn't care. And we've all watched what Benjamin Netanyahu has to say about this. I mean, Matt and I, and I'm sure you yourself sat through his UN General Assembly speech. That's not a guy who's ready to make a deal that will result in Palestinian statehood.
Well, he said very clearly there will never be a Palestinian state. He said it in English. He said it in Hebrew. He said it to whoever wants to listen. That is completely counter to however vague the language might be at point 19 of the 20-point peace plan.
Yeah, because those are all such interesting points, because they really tell us about where we're going and what needs to be done and who needs to be putting pressure and speaking to Trump about these issues. The thing we have to realize about Trump, and this is something that his former national security advisor, General H.R. McMaster, wrote about in his book when he wrote about serving as Trump's first national security advisor. He said that Trump is really influenced by whoever the last person in the room is. So whenever his cabinet members, including H.R. McMaster, when he was there with with General Mattis, and at the Defense Department at the time, Rex Tillerson at the State Department, that he would always try to be the last person to leave the room, because he knew that whatever Trump heard last would be the thing that stuck in his mind, even if he'd just been in like a 2-hour meeting. The only thing he would come out with was what he heard last. So that's one thing. And then the other thing is that at his core, Trump is someone who wants to be liked, like genuinely liked, not just feared or admired, but liked. And so whenever he goes and does a speech like the one he did in the Knesset, he would say the same thing if he went and did a speech in Saudi Arabia or Egypt or wherever. He just wants the crowd to think he is the best thing ever. So I would take that, pomp and circumstance, if you will, with a grain of salt. What really matters is something that you mentioned, Anushka, earlier, which is I think it was you, Matt, how much he genuinely likes the Gulf and the Gulf leaders. He has admiration for them. He admires their wealth. He admires what they've done in their countries and what they've built.
And the interior design, that marble and gold. He loves that marble and gold.
He gets a lot of inspiration from that. And so he listens. And I think that, Anushka, what you were mentioning about the 2-state solution language in the 20-point plan, it is very, very, very vague. It doesn't even say that Palestinians have a right to self-determination and statehood. It says, if you do everything right, it may lead to a path towards self-determination and statehood, because we know that's what you want, the Palestinians. It's not enshrined as it is your right. So, but even that vague language was placed in there because of conversations that he had with Arabs in the region, and he listened to them.
And it's worth saying that when you speak to representatives of those Arab countries, they are clear that if he wants his normalization between them and Israel, his only hope of getting there, including for Saudi Arabia, is to make sure that there is a clear path to that. I mean, I think his relationship with the Qataris is totally fascinating, but also something that is getting a bit of backlash here in the US ever since they announced this idea of joint training with the Qataris in Idaho. I mean, there has been a bit of a MAGA backlash on that.
I want to get to that, but I want to make sure I finish just the point about the two-state solution and statehood and where this is eventually supposed to end up. Because if we look at the Israeli side, there is a real sort of trauma focused response to any conversations about a two-state solution right now. When I talk to my Israeli friends or Israelis that I interview, they make it clear that October 7th was a type of trauma that will be difficult, if not impossible, to recover from. And what that did to them in terms of trust with the Palestinians. And I think trust is going to be one of the things that will be most difficult to restore, but most important, because now you have Israeli leadership, not just current leadership, but potential future leadership as well. I'm talking about all of the opposition figures, Naftali Bennett, Lieberman, Lapid, Golan. Nobody's talking about a Palestinian state. Some of it is ideological, like with Netanyahu, who just doesn't believe that there should ever be a Palestinian state on ideology. And some of it is just, well, that's just going to be a threat to us. Look at what happened in October 7th. Some of it is security based. But that will be one of the most difficult things in any conflict resolution process moving forward, is to try to restore that trust.
Yeah, I think you're so right. I mean, when I was in Israel last, few months ago, and I spoke to my Israeli friends who I still have from the days when I lived there in 1989, they were all, peaceniks, as we used to call them. They were all very fervent about a two-state solution. They've all, rather like your friends, have said, no, that's not going to happen. We can't ever imagine that. We don't trust the Palestinians. But unless you rebuild that trust, you're not going to get some kind of, living side by side. I just wonder, Jasmine, to what extent the diminution or the weakening of Iran has an impact of the future of what happens in Gaza, because of course Iran was supposedly Hamas's big backer.
Yes and no. It was actually less of a of a factor than. There were several different ways of supporting Hamas. One was through arms, one was through funds. We can't forget also that Prime Minister Netanyahu had greenlit and in fact asked the Qataris to continue sending money to Hamas because of his divide and conquer policy towards the Palestinians. Netanyahu always wanted to weaken the PA in the West Bank and strengthen Hamas in Gaza so that the Palestinians would continue to be divided and wouldn't pose a threat to Israel by actually creating a unified government that could then request things like statehood from the international community and so on. So now that funding stream has been cut, now that you have Egypt and other countries willing to crack down on things like smuggling through tunnels, it will be very, very difficult for Hamas to rearm and pose the kind of threat that it did to Israel. Also, by virtue of the fact that its entire leadership structure mostly has been decimated, either assassinated or, assassinated, basically. I think the three people who were really in charge of masterminding and carrying out October 7th, including Yahya Sinwar, of course, have all been killed. And Hamas is now walking around in Gaza as an organization without any structure or leadership, and with a vast amount of their capabilities having been destroyed. So it goes back to something we were talking about earlier, which is, what are they going to be doing right now? They're not going to be focused on Israel much. The danger they pose now is to Palestinians in Gaza.
So how does this not end up as a civil war inside Gaza?
Exactly right. I mean, that's, I referenced Iraq, post-war Iraq, and the decades of challenges that they had after the US invasion, the US and I think the West in general, and this is a point that I saw, really throughout my years in government, is there is a tendency to pick favorites in the Middle East, support them and arm them, and then let them kind of fight it out. There hasn't generally been a sustained energy and attention and effort towards helping any of these post-conflict states in the region build up in a way that was sustainable and in a way that was credible and bottom up. There's always interference from the outside. There are always countries, there are always opinions that say, well, we like these people, we don't like these people, so we're going to, give these people a chance. And if they want to go against their own people, we're just going to let that happen. And you saw a little bit of that in what Trump was saying about Hamas going after other factions and rivals in Gaza. It's like, let them fight it out, which is, of course, extremely destabilizing.
Jasmine, it's been so interesting having you. We're not going to keep you any longer, but really, really appreciate your time and totally fascinating to hear what you had to say.
Thanks so much. It's a great pleasure to be with you.
Thanks very much.
You.
That's all we have time for on Trump World today. Next week, we will delve a bit more into what Donald Trump is doing pretty controversially here in the US. I will see you next Wednesday.
Absolutely. And me too. I'm not going on any more holidays, I promise you, ever again. But yeah, I think it's important to have, Trump on the world stage has done one thing. He's had his best week ever. Trump on the domestic stage, an entirely different story and a pretty controversial one, which we cannot keep our eyes off. So we'll see you next week. That's it from Trump World, from Anushka and me. Thanks very much.